The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Against the backdrop of a US-China trade war, how EU-India FTA could be a game-changer. Our geopolitical landscape has been significantly shaped by continuing trade tensions between the United States and China. Following the Trump administration's draconian tariffs imposed on Beijing, the ripple effects are being felt globally. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and economic nationalism, an impending free trade agreement between the European Union and India has emerged as a potential game-changer. It could reshape global trade dynamics, eliminate tariffs, reduce trade barriers, and foster closer economic cooperation between the two regions. Yet the negotiations are not without challenges. To learn more about the benefits, challenges, and geopolitical implications of an EU-India FTA, please tune into our next live panel debate.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this Democracy Forum debate where we examine closely issues of the day, often ones that are overlooked by mainstream media and commentary, but which have a huge global significance. So today's debate, against the backdrop of a US-China trade war, how a European Union-India free trade agreement could be a game changer. Yes, we talk so much about the world balance defined by America and China. What about those other spheres of influence where values are less defined by superpower rivalry? India's population 1.4 billion and growing within the global south. The European Union 450 million among the developed economies of the West. What will happen if they become closer? To debate this issue, we welcome Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki, policy advisor on international trade at the Jacques Delors Institut, Anunita Chandrasekar at the Center of European Reform. Another panelist, Mohan, Kumar, former Indian ambassador to France, has unfortunately been called away on urgent Indian government business, but valiantly stepping in is Darius Nasimi, founder of the UK Central Asia Business Council, to talk about wider regional implications. And we also hope to have with us Niclas Poitiers of the Centre for European Policy Analysis in Brussels. Barry Gardner, MP, the chair of the Democracy Forum, has rushed from flying into Gatwick Airport to be with us today. Thank you, Barry, and he will sum up at the end. And I ask the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and canvas of our debate. So, Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which provides a respite from the dominant narrative of the friction arising from the strained relations between the United States and its trading partners. In contrast, the ongoing negotiations to reach a free trade agreement between the European Union and India appear to be approaching a satisfactory conclusion. So I'm very grateful to the forum for highlighting the importance of this topic and providing such a distinguished group of experts to discuss this milestone in the history of diplomatic relations between the EU and India. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank Humphrey Hawksley for chairing the panel. In a report published by the World Bank yesterday, the global economy is projected to slow sharply this year, with the trade tension setting the stage for the weakest decade of growth since the 1960s. The World Bank chief economist, Indebit Gill, warns, I quote, "The world's economy is once more running into turbulence, but economic cooperation is better than any of the alternatives for all parties," he added. Over the last 20 years, the value of trade between the European Union and India has grown by more than 3 times, last year reaching $135 billion, and making the European Union India's largest trading partner. Although India's approach to negotiating free trade agreements has often been ambivalent, the current round of negotiations with the United Kingdom and the EU, which started in earnest in 2021, underlie the Modi government's ambition for India to become a $10 trillion economy within a decade, thereby displacing Germany as the world's 3rd largest economy. But there is no doubt that the threat posed to the liberal international order by President Trump's arbitrary imposition of tariff walls has quickened the pace of negotiations, between the European Union and India, traveling to New Delhi in February with the entire College of EU Commissioners. President Ursula von der Leyen described her bloc's ambition for trade with India to have the potential, I quote, to be one of the defining partnerships of the century. And speaking this morning at a press conference in Switzerland, the Union Minister for Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, sounded upbeat about the negotiations. I quote, "There's a saying which goes so near and yet so far, and I would believe in the case of the European Union, we are really very near," he said. And as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace observes, I quote, "If the United States-induced turbulence and an assertive China do not bring the EU and India closer together, nothing will. But the planets appear to be aligned this time round." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you very much, Lord Bruce. Planets in alignment, are they? Turbulence, running into turbulence, and economic cooperation is better than any other alternative. Where does that leave us? First, we go to Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki, policy advisor on international trade at the Jacques Delors Institute. Among his many publications, a recent paper on EU-India relations, where will they be in 2030? And another one, how China, Europe, Japan, and the United States shaped the world through economic security. Is that still relevant? He has worked with international organizations and national governments and provided expertise on negotiations and the implementation of multilateral and regional trade agreements. And his doctoral research at Cambridge focused on India trade agreements. Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki, an India-EU free trade agreement, could it be a game changer? Give us your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for having me on for this excellent and very timely webinar. We heard a lot of the upbeat assessments that have recently come out from various government officials. I want to make the case that the EU-India economic relationship has actually been one of the most frustrating stories in international trade. So all the way back in 2007, the EU and India had started to negotiate what should have been even then a game-changing trade and investment agreement. But today, of course, that deal is still not concluded. But frankly, we can no longer afford that situation. So the question is really, what went wrong? Well, if we look back to 2007, everything back then looked very promising. Globalization was humming along and both sides were optimistic about a rapid conclusion. But even then, the negotiations dragged on for almost 6 years, and by 2013, they collapsed. And there were several reasons for that. First, we had classic commercial conflicts in such a negotiation. Europe wanted to sell more cars and spirits to India. India wanted easier access for IT professionals to work in Europe, and neither side would really budge. Then we got bogged down in technical disputes over intellectual property and data security, the kind of issues that make lawyers rich, but that can kill political momentum. And add to that the new co-decision powers for trade agreements in the European Union's Lisbon Treaty from 2009, and then the election of Narendra Modi in 2014, who didn't want to conclude any new trade agreements and even went ahead and canceled existing bilateral investment treaties with, amongst many other countries, also European countries. But what's really worrying me is that over the last 2 decades, when all of this happened, the EU and India have actually become less important to each other economically. And when we are thinking about de-risking today, which is really the name of the game, it's important to think about that for a moment. So European exports to India are just 1.9% of the EU's total global exports. And that is actually down from 2.1% a decade ago. So yes, we're trading more, but in relative terms, we're actually trading less with each other. The investment relationship tells a similar story. EU investment in India is about 3% of the EU's global total, but India's share in that has actually not really budged since 2008. So the problem is that this trend doesn't really fit with our political priorities. Both Europe and India desperately need alternatives to overdependence on China, and now also alternatives to an increasingly unpredictable United States. For Europe, bringing supply chains home isn't realistic because we are a very open economy. We're actually much more open than the United States. So we need reliable partners. And India should be perfect for that. It's growing fast, has demand for green technology, demand for consumer products, and its demand for digital services is also exploding. And yet the EU has been losing market share in 19 out of the 20 main product categories that we export to India. And that should really be a wake-up call. So what's the solution? Well, I think we should have learned something important from our past failures, from this earlier period that I was alluding to previously between 2007 and 2013. Trying too much can kill a deal, but at the same time, doing too little will also not shift the needle for de-risking. So right now, there are two new issues: the European carbon border adjustment mechanism and also European deforestation regulations, which can really easily derail negotiations. So my take is that we should think about sustainability issues and park them in a separate track, like a clean trade and investment partnership, which is a new type of agreement that the EU is starting to pursue, and that runs in parallel to these main trade negotiations. And this way, I think we can have the technical work, for example, on carbon pricing and traceability for forest products, without holding up our discussions on tariff reductions. So any revenue, for example, that the EU would collect from Indian steel and aluminum under a carbon border adjustment mechanism would go straight into decarbonization projects in India. And that could also mean we could create space for India's future emissions trading system while keeping our climate standards intact. But most importantly, handling these climate issues separately from the trade negotiations. And the main agreement really focusing on what businesses actually want, which is eliminating tariffs on cars, on spirits, on having transparent government procurement rules that don't discriminate against European firms, and also having better rules for digital trade. But we need to keep in mind at the same time that that only a commercially meaningful deal would unlock the kinds of economies of scale that companies on both sides are missing, and that would send a clear signal that the EU and India can do business together. So I think the original EU-India talks failed in 2013 because our ambitions exceeded our political capacity when our interests weren't fully aligned and there was a low level of trust. But the thing is that precisely because the EU and India are now becoming less important to each other economically, a comprehensive agreement is more strategically valuable than ever before. So by simplifying this agenda and focusing on the core market access issues, we could finally turn this potential into reality, even if this may not happen by the end of the year as some political actors would like it to be. So to me, the question is not whether we can afford to do this deal. To me, the question is really whether we can afford not to do it. So let me leave it at that for now.
Nicolas, Köhler-Suzuki, thank you very much for that. Can I just encapsulate that? The first thing is the current global situation, let's say since the Trump presidency began. Has the talk been spurred on both sides following your agenda? This is what we must do. We must speed it up. We have to sort of put some more fuel in the tank here, or has that not yet percolated?
No, absolutely it has. And Lord Bruce was alluding previously to the fact that the entire college visited Delhi in February of this year, which is a novelty that's never happened before. So it showed that there is political momentum. The problem is that political momentum itself is not sufficient. It's not a sufficient across the finish line. So you have, yeah, please go ahead.
Look, sorry, I just wanted to sort of get back to basics in a way. This term free trade agreement, which is now being bandied around in geopolitics, the UK has recently had a free trade agreement with India. How does that compare, what the UK had, to what the EU is negotiating, and why is it different?
Well, the UK agreement with India is going to be watched very, very closely, because it will contain the kernels of the negotiation space that the EU will probably have with India as well. The problem is that there are clear definitions of what an FTA can be for it to be consistent with the rules of the World Trade Organization, namely Article 24 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and Article 5 of the General Agreement on Trade and Services. For that to happen, it would mean that substantially all trade between the FTA partners needs to be freed. Now, India has preferred in the past the types of agreement that would not free substantially all trade, but that would only free a little bit of trade. In many of the agreements, it has concluded that was possible because those were done with other developing countries, and there are special exceptions under WTO rules for that. But in a negotiation with, let's say, Australia, which it has done, in negotiations with the UK or with EFTA, which were recently concluded, it has to be wider than that. And what analysts like myself are looking at quite closely now is what will actually be in this agreement with the UK. And we don't know yet, because the full extent of what has actually been agreed is not yet released.
And you were talking about the frustrations. Is that caused and both the European Union and India are known as these sort of cumbersome entities where you've got 1,000 voices competing against each other to get things across the line. Is it India or is it the EU that is causing most of the frustration?
Well, that is certainly a question of perspective. So,
on your perspective,
from the perspective of trying to get market access, there is frustration on the European side, because there is the hope that certain market access barriers will be removed after all this time. I was laying out the timelines we're talking about here, negotiations happening since 2007. In fact, the first time this agreement was anticipated at the political level was as early as 2004. So this is over 20 years ago. Oh, yeah. So there's frustration on that side. On the side of the Indians, there is frustration because there are certain expectations from Europeans that they don't agree with. Certain expectations that this agreement will encompass a lot of different issues that the Indian side doesn't necessarily think should be part of a trade agreement. And that precisely entails, for example, the question of sustainability standards, of labor standards, which are part and parcel of European trade agreements.
Yes, so it's different issues, but the equal sort of blocks and frustrations. Very quickly, before I let you go and we move on, from one of the audience, Anil Batra, India is essentially a very old-style protectionist economy. How easy will it be to undo all that to facilitate a free trade agreement with the EU? You've given us a bit of that, but can you address that question directly?
Yeah, a couple of things to unpack, of course. Very old-style protectionist economy, yes and no, of course. That still continues to exist in the Indian context. At the same time, we have, of course, also seen a lot of reform in India. The problem is that a lot of the questions that the EU would like to see addressed in a trade agreement, in part, entail domestic economic reforms on the Indian side that go beyond just a trade negotiation. So commitments that would have to be made, for example, in terms of government procurement, would require a wider domestic economic reform package, which doesn't necessarily sit easily with the political constituencies of the current administration in India. Yeah. So there is a window of opportunity for that, but it does probably entail that there are wider-reaching economic reforms happening at home in India.
Thank you very much for that. Stay with us because we're going to widen the debate now to Anunita Chandrasekar from the Center of European reform. She researches European foreign policy with a focus on Europe-Asia relations and has recently published a policy insight on upgrading EU-India relations. And she cites European leaders talking about a new strategic agenda with so much unexplored potential. But she argues the EU-India relationship is much thinner than it could be. Whose fault is that, Anunita Chandrasekar, and could it be strengthened to become a game changer? Give us your argument.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions, Humphrey. Thank you also, Niclas, for his very insightful groundwork laying for this topic. So whose fault is that? I think I argue that there has been a mutual lack of interest and understanding on both the Indian and European side. For India, Europe has often been seen as a trade bloc, and India has had much stronger bilateral relations with certain countries, such as most notably France, but it hasn't quite engaged with Europe on the European level in the way that Europeans hope. For Europe, India hasn't necessarily been its primary focus within Asia. Of course, China has been a far bigger, especially in the early 2000s, there was a lot of China optimism, but now we see as of 2019, China is designated a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. So there's, been a change in this kind of balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and Europe is looking towards other actors in Asia that it could, as Niclas, I think, mentioned, use part of risking and strategy and diversifying this sort of China plus one. So I think there's been, in some ways, a mutual lack of interest, a mutual lack of understanding on both sides for various different reasons. But I think, as we say, against the backdrop of this US-China trade war, against a more kind of volatile protectionist world, the EU and India, as Niclas has also mentioned, as economies that have a much higher trade to GDP ratio than, for example, the US or China, they very much both benefit from a stable and predictable kind of global trade environment, and also partners that they can rely on. So I think the Commission's visit in February really signaled that Europe wanted to be taken seriously as Europe, as an actor, not just certain member states. And I think there's also a greater Indian interest in engaging with Europe as Europe, and also many different parts of the European Union. So the Nordic Baltic countries, recently they've had a summit with India, also many Central Eastern European countries. Poland is putting together an Indo-Pacific strategy, which it didn't previously have. So I think on both sides, there's a lot more engagement momentum, and both sides are kind of remedying their lack of interest in the other.
I was expecting you to continue a little bit more, but I just wondered if from your sort of perch the center of European reform there, and we looked at with Niclas's thing of the 2030 in India thing. We talked about the problems of getting it across the line, but if it did succeed, how would it look, and would it be a game changer? And
well, I think absolutely. I mean, when you look at the EU strategy for dealing with the first Trump administration, we see that it was also trying to conduct trade agreements with new partners and diversify its kind of range of partnerships. So the biggest one is Vietnam, which was, I think, something like the 19th most significant trading partner of the EU at the time. But since the agreement was concluded, I think there was a 40% increase in trade between Vietnam and Europe, and some much smaller economy, which has a much range of goods and services, whereas India's trade with Europe in both goods and services stands to massively boom. There's also very recently been the opening of a Federation of European Business Interests in India, suggesting that there's a lot more appetite for foreign direct investment in India. India is becoming a lot more open to that. You can see as it's trying to become, Viksit Bharat, developed India, and also almost quadruple its exports. Almost quadruple its exports to around 2 trillion by 2030. That's going to be looking for new markets. This could offer European consumers more choice, and also the opportunity to risk from China, which is potentially going to become an increasingly difficult partner to deal with.
Yes,
well
I'm sort of quite. Could you expand a little bit on the elements you said about the bilateral relations that India's had with various European countries, and how that would change perspective if there was an EU free trade agreement? It would mean that those individual countries still trade under that element. So India could still come in and sort of pick them off and have them compete against each other.
Well, I think countries with existing strong bilateral relations would perhaps benefit more at first, but I don't think that necessarily would need to remain the case. I think that many countries would be looking to diversify. So historically, when you look, I think the biggest source of European sources of FDI are the Netherlands, France, and I think Germany. So these are, obvious reasons. Have an interest in India, but I don't think that means that the European countries can't find their way within this framework of kind of foreign direct investment becoming easier. And when you look at actually the EFTA agreement that Nicolas mentioned, one of the most interesting and quite unique aspects of it is this sort of guarantee, of nominal guarantee, that there's going to be around, I think, 100 million invested in India, and that EFTA countries guarantee this. So clearly there's an appetite for all kinds of increasing foreign direct investment from a much wider range of European sources in India.
Yes, there's a question here from Prashant Kumar. What might be the impact on jobs in the European Union following a free trade agreement with India, given that it will be a lot more profitable for EU companies to import services from India?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and what that will have to be considered when trying to sell this agreement. I mean, when considering another similar agreement that the European Union has recently concluded but not ratified with Mercosur countries. So in Latin America, this has been in the works for almost as long as the India agreement, I think around 25 years. But it's finally, and also perhaps spurred by this kind of Trump moment, has finally been pushed through. It remains to be ratified by European countries with a special pushback from France, Poland, because of pressure from the agricultural sector. So I think even if this does get to the finish line and it might have all of these benefits for European business, it still has to be ratified in every member state, and there are going to have to be mechanisms on the national level that ensure potential impacts on jobs and have things that factor in impacts on European workers and Indian workers.
This question of that you've raised there on ratification of the sort of process of a free trade agreement, because as I mentioned earlier, it's being bandied around a lot, particularly here in Britain, but also as a kind of political leverage weapon, really. But actually getting one through, we're not talking about 2030, are we? As Niclas's paper says, we're talking about 2040 or 2050, aren't we?
Well, I mean, that depends on the kind of consensus amongst member states. That depends on whether it is kind of more beneficial to push this forward. But I mean, especially with kind of national elections in Poland, they're upcoming years. In France, also not far away, that something that's perceived as being, undercutting European jobs will not be popular. So I think there's also very much a question of how we communicate this. I mean, I think you see this even with the UK free trade agreement. I think, you've seen this even with the UK free trade agreement. There was this certain clause about migration mobility that was worked on by the press and really kind of distorted to make it seem as if this is something that would, be undercutting UK service workers. but because of the visas offered when actually this is common practice. So I think there has to be careful consideration of the messaging around this and the way this is presented as not, undercutting European workers.
Yeah, and could you put it in a sort of broader geopolitical perspective in that the polarization, for want of a better word, between the US and China, with the tariff war that President Trump is putting on, this concept that we must bring everything back home, we should disrupt supply chains and all the rest of it. The momentum between India and Europe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that would be a game changer, wouldn't it, if it was seen to work and suddenly the people around the world or the voter in America or the UK says, yes, actually, we do need to have these sort of agreements in place.
No, absolutely. Showing a sort of commitment to openness in trade, and that this is kind of European and Indian prosperity, and I mean global prosperity, that especially, as I've mentioned, Europe and India, which are countries with a higher openness to trade and a higher trade to GDP ratio, they know that you cannot cut yourself off from the world. And I think this could be a clear sign that cooperation is far better, like considered cooperation that doesn't undercut the interests and priorities by the country in development, in protecting jobs, in social security, etc. This could be a kind of cornerstone, show that the actual cornerstone of the global system is cooperation rather than isolationism.
Yet when the hard negotiations are on about how to license a computer chip or whatever it is between the two services and that, the negotiators don't realize or what is at stake there is not on their radar. That if we can make this work quickly, then we can depolarize the world.
That's quite a task for a free trade agreement, I have to say, depolarizing the world. But it certainly would have symbolic resonance, and I do think Europe and India, as countries that are committed to maintaining a kind of rules-based global order, in some ways a multipolar order that is not, beholden to any one power or any one kind of overarching power. I think this has a lot of symbolic resonance in showing that alliances, cooperation, compromise are the way forward.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I want to come back to you both at the end to sort of talk about some of the more nitty-gritty elements of it. But I want to go to our third speaker now, Darius Nasimi, who has bravely stepped in the shoes of Mohan Kumar, who couldn't make it. Darius is the founder of the UK Central Asia Business Council, an area where we could imagine an EU-India strength relationship could have a huge impact in the Central Asian round there. His family fled Afghanistan in 1999, and he's built a career around forging trade links between there, Britain and elsewhere. He is also a former Conservative parliamentary candidate. Darius Nasimi, how much of an impact would a strengthened EU-India relationship have on the wider South and Central Asian regions? Give us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I just want to focus on two main areas, which is on the Central Asian side, but also on the wider impact on India itself. But I want to start off by saying that I think both Europe and India have a strong shared interest in maintaining a balance of power in an Indo-Pacific region that is increasingly shaped by China. And India's ambitious domestic agenda of modernization and sustainability, I think, goes hand in hand with several of Europe's foreign economic priorities. And both the EU and India are seeking to reduce their dependency on China, especially in areas such as minerals. India can play a role in helping Europe to de-risk and to diversify those supply chains, especially as it's become the world's fifth largest economy in terms of PPE, projected to become the world's third largest by 2030, and obviously a very highly populated country as well. And the Indian government's Make in India plan seeks to turn India into a manufacturing hub to rival China, with the goal of reaching, I think, $2 trillion in exports by 2030, and also reducing extreme poverty as well. And I think all of this is really relevant to the situation in Central Asia as well. Countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, because we're not too far from South Asia, and the proximity also plays a role. And Central Asia is also very close to China as well. And when I recently traveled to Uzbekistan, I could see the high level of Chinese trade relations with Uzbekistan, building factories, exporting cars, buses, and also in different sectors, in solar energy as well. So I think that the EU-India relationship impacts Central Asia by creating greater regional connectivity, economic growth, but also they can both leverage on each other's strengths in areas like trade and investment. And political dialogue and human rights is another area. Security cooperation in areas like counterterrorism and organized crime, and climate change and green transition. There's lots of climate initiatives that the EU is running in Central Asia, and that could be complemented by Indian efforts as well. And I think the other area that I wanted to focus on was also the impact of the trade war. Because the US-China trade war is fundamentally reshaping the global trading system, and India is also Asia's third largest economy. And I think one area that I want to focus on is clean energy and clean technology, because both the EU and India have ambitions to become more self-reliant. But there is, of course, fierce Chinese competition. 95% of the solar panels installed in the EU come from China. And Chinese wind turbine manufacturers have also taken 40% of the Indian market share. And at the same time, the US has increased its tariffs on the EU as well. So on the one hand, I think the US-China trade war is bringing higher prices for everyone, including the EU and India. And as it becomes more difficult for Chinese goods to enter the US because of the tariffs, they're going to have to find alternative markets. And India is obviously a huge market. So the EU and India, they both want to become manufacturing powerhouses in advanced clean energy. But then there's also the risk of Chinese overcapacity and the increase in low-cost, state-subsidized clean technology products from China, which were supposed to go to the US. So that will affect the domestic local renewable industries in India and in other countries as well. But then it's not just the deployment of clean technology, it's also the manufacturing, developing a critical mineral supply together with other countries like Australia or South Africa through co-investing in mineral projects. I think that is another area that the EU and India will be focusing on. And that can also lead to, that can also be closely related to the US-China trade war. And then there's other areas like solar energy. I think there's areas of common ground between the EU and India, because the EU solar supply is in need of diversification. But then India has set goals to achieve self-sufficiency in producing solar panels and already reducing its reliance on China. So these are areas where the two are quite compatible. But then at the same time, there are areas where they need to maintain domestic production, for example, in wind power. So a way of overcoming that is maybe ensuring reciprocal market access, to be able to compete with China's giant, well-established clean technology companies. And I think the EU should also do more to address India's concerns about the carbon border mechanisms, which can place a burden on Indian exports, and support the companies from Indian companies to meet the compliance requirements as well. and the deepening cooperation on carbon pricing. But I think to answer your question, I think it's a really uncertain period of time for Central Asia, for South Asia as well. But I think the US-China trade war is obviously leading to the EU and India finding strength in each other's relationship, and that's why I think the global supply chains have been disrupted. The tech conflict between the US and China, the polarization of the world, and India offers the EU access to a massive consumer market. So there's lots of positives and also things that we need to be careful about. But then, sorry.
No, I'd just like to put the point that you made back, particularly to Nicolas. The solar energy, the detail of all that, and what Darius was outlining, is that sort of thing. Is that going to be possible, or is it going to get bogged down for another 50 years?
Well, I don't think there's a concern on the European side to import more solar panels from India. I think that would certainly be very much welcome. I do think there's a strategic question whether this is really something that is of large concern, because China produces solar panels very cheaply. But once you import a solar panel, usually it's there, right? So the strategic question is kind of moot once you have installed it, because the most you could do strategically, you could slow down the green transition, where in that case China would shoot itself in the foot. I mean, there have been some reports recently about inverters that have cellular modules, but apart from that, I think the largest strategic question probably now is about wind turbines. So India can certainly play a role in diversifying access to solar panels, but I think it's going to be a long road to become competitive with the cheap solar panels that the EU is currently importing.
Thank you for that. So I want to come back to Darius now on this one. I mean, in the region, apart from India itself, is there an element where India can be seen as a leader, can be seen as a model to follow, as opposed to China, or has China just got everything wrapped up, Darius?
No, I think that there is a lot to. I think the rise of India's economy and the growth that India has seen, I think that can be seen as a role model by a lot of countries in Central Asia, especially as they were post-Soviet republics, part of the USSR, and now you look at the situation in Eastern Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it brings back a lot of those memories for Central Asia when they were part of the Soviet Union, and also the repression that they were facing by the governments. And at the same time, when you look at the Chinese treatment of ethnic minorities, especially the Muslim community, that is also another area of concern for Central Asian countries, especially.
So in a way, if India could prove itself, and if the EU and India could prove itself by getting this across the line, there could be a new global model sitting out there that people would prefer to see as the beacon.
I mean, I don't think that it will, because it can create a model for people to see as an alternative source of hope. But of course, US and China are the leading countries here. But for example, going back to solar energy, I mean, Central Asia have very, very hot summers. So solar energy is an area that would hugely benefit Central Asian countries in terms of reducing their dependency on Russia for energy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I would want to bring everybody in now, Anunita, Chandrasekar as well. If I could put to you a question from Philip Bowman, and then take it around the panel, interpreted as you wish. Might differences in regulatory standards, market access, and intellectual property rights between the EU and India present hurdles in finalizing the FTA? We've discussed a bit of it. Let's try to nail it. Anunita, Chandrasekar?
Well, I think you've identified exactly some of the hurdles towards finalizing a free trade agreement. Essentially, as Niclas has talked about, there are India and Europe very different conceptions of intellectual property and what this might mean for both sides, and finding some sort of alignment.
Problem with definition is there, when they two negotiators sit down, they're going to have to define all these things before they even start negotiating.
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things about this round of free trade negotiations is that they've been split up into a section on intellectual property, a section on GIS, geographical indicators, as well as the core free trade agreement. So I think there's a sense that some of these issues might be knottier than others. And of course, the climate issues that Nicolas has mentioned, and sustainability issues, and that kind of decoupling them in some ways might be a way of dealing with them as they're potentially more intractable and giving them time and space, as these are some of the core issues that Philip very astutely pointed out.
Niclas, your view?
Yeah, I fully agree with Anunita here. So these are some of the key hurdles, apart from what we talked about earlier, the sustainable development chapter that has also proven to be quite contentious. So if we break this down, I mean, market access, what are we talking about here? On the European side, I was alluding to this in my opening statement. We're talking about European interest to gain market access for the rapidly growing consumer market in India, right? So key export interests here on the European side are especially the premium cars exported from Europe. In 2013, there seemed to be a potential deal, a potential landing zone on the horizon with a certain quota that could be offered. Maybe we'll see a similar landing zone in the near future. We're also talking about wines and spirits. That was very, very important as well for the UK, which now got its deal for the Scottish industry, especially. It was key when the UK was still part of the EU. Now, of course, it has shifted a little bit in terms of emphasis. So now French wines are quite important. There is a limited number of consumers in India for alcohol, but it's a very quickly growing market. So
yes.
That's why it continues to be a key market access concern.
Could I just, because we have lots of these different things, put to you the phrase that I used with Darius there, this beacon element, and I used it because this is what the European Union was referred to so much after the end of the Cold War, and various cultures and governments were coming together. Are we in a situation where this could be a beacon element in this polarization, the new US, whatever that is, and what China is, or is it just too difficult and too complicated to make it work? Niclas, if you could sum up in a second on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would not overinterpret this. I mean, this is a commercial deal. Okay. I would not overinterpret this as something that's much more far-reaching, to be honest.
Okay.
And obviously, we have this element of standing up for a rules-based order, but in that respect, I think it's actually much more important to look what India is going to do now with the United States, whether they are willing to agree on a deal with the Trump administration that basically gives up on the MFN principle of the World Trade Organization, the most favored nation principle, which would actually effectively mean that they're abandoning rules-based order. So that's, I think, more something to look out for rather than whether or not we get a trade agreement between the EU and India.
Darius, yes or no? Do you agree with Niclas on that?
No, I do think for a lot of countries like Central Asia that are developing, that are in that stage of diversification and opening up to the world, I think India can be this free trade agreement can be a beacon of hope. Yeah. Okay. But to answer your question about the regulatory issues and so on, I think there are issues like intellectual property, aligning labor laws with international standards, But at the same time, the tariffs on Indian exports of steel, aluminium, and cement to the EU, I think there are issues that will delay the free trade agreement from being signed.
In which case it won't become the. I'm going to have to, but thank you very much there, because I'm going to have to bring in now Barry Gardner, who has rushed from the airport to be with us and listen across. He is the chair of the Democracy Forum, an MP and veteran of the British government, of Parliament, and relations with India. Barry, what do you make of our debate?
Well, first of all, Humphrey, can you hear me? That's the most important thing.
Yes, we can.
Good, because I'm actually still in Gatwick Airport. I worked out that the Times were not going to let me get back to Parliament. Look, can I just say, I think the most important thing that was said in that whole discussion was right at the end, when I think it was Nicolas said, this is a commercial deal. And the way in which the question has been posed at the beginning about, will this solve the problems of the world between US and China? I think we've comprehensively, I hope, gutted that. It's a commercial deal. It'll be done for commercial reasons, and it will be negotiated as such. It will not be negotiated in order to create stability in the Pacific. It will not be negotiated to simply stem the rising power of China. They may be happy consequences that arise from it, but that's not the purpose of what's going on. What we're seeing is two of the largest consumer markets potentially in the world coming together and saying, doesn't it make sense for us to do business together on slightly better terms than we have been doing so far? I wanted to pick up on what was said about CBAM and deforestation, and whether that whole aspect of the potential agreement should be sidelined and put on a separate track so that we simply have a trade and investment partnership. CBAM, I think, is a serious problem because the EU regards this as the right thing to do and fair. Basically, the carbon border adjustment mechanism would put a price of carbon to penalize countries who were more carbon profligate in their manufacturing process. But of course, those countries are precisely the ones which normally have other advantages that are able to reduce the price. Not just that they're producing dirtier products in that sense, but because their labor costs are often lower and so on. Sometimes it's because of subsidy of fuel as well. And they think this is the right thing to do, and they say it needn't redound on the country. But from the perspective of the Global South, and certainly from India's perspective, this is simply yet another example of the EU putting up a trade barrier. The EU is famous for its trade barriers, for its being a blockage on trade to anything external, and protecting itself. And this seems to India, I think, to be just another example of that. Deforestation problem, I don't think, is quite as big a problem, although it was mentioned in the same breath by Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki, because the EU has put in place something that says, look, forest products must be not only legal, but they must be sustainable. And they've done that because of the response that happened during Bolsonaro's time in South America, where what he did was simply, when the EU put in place the legal requirement, he simply changed the law in Brazil so that the Amazon could be continued to be deforested in the same old way. And so that's why the sustainability criteria is there. This isn't the case with India. India wants to get its forestation right. I don't think it's as big a problem at all. I think that can be overcome. CBAM, I think, really does remain. I thought it was really important what Anunita was saying about the volatile protectionist world. and the need for or the engagement with the EU being important rather than having these bilateral relationships, because it is important that they regard each other as blocks, and if you have a reliable trading partner, then that is supposed to bring stability. But look, we would have thought that the USA was a reliable trading partner. We would have probably said that it was one of our most reliable trading partners a few years ago. Certainly hasn't proven to be the case now. And what's happening here in the imposition of tariffs now, not just as a measure to protect yourselves from unfair subsidy from other countries, but as a measure, as Trump sees it, to even up an imbalance in trade. This is quite extraordinary, particularly for anyone who has a perspective of the free market, because traditionally America would have said, well, an imbalance of trade comes because our people want to buy more of your people's stuff than your people want to buy of ours. Now, that's just individuals making free choices, and as such, it's the free market working properly. But Trump's come in and said, look, to hell with that. It's something that we have got to sort out because it isn't fair. Well, it's not a matter of fairness, it's just what people want if you take that free market approach that America has traditionally taken. So when Darius and Anunita are saying, look, the post-war global order really is up for grabs here, that's absolutely right. And we see it in the breakdown at the WTO, and we see it in the breakdown even in NATO, as well as what Trump's doing simply on trade, but we see it in the United Nations as well. So we live in these very febrile times, and it's very interesting that the EU looks at China and talks quite rightly about the Uyghurs and the exploitation of human beings and modern slavery and so on, and I think this is somewhere where India does need to wise up. ILO rights, clauses against modern slavery, these sorts of human rights things are an integral part of trade. And we really should be trying to make more of those rather than say, oh, well, we can't possibly, include labor rights as part of what we need to do in trade. In fact, a few years ago, I launched a paper at the World Trade Organization in Geneva called Just Trading, precisely on this basis. And it was interesting because the minister that launched it with me wasn't oh gosh, his name's just gone out of my head, but it was the Indian minister who launched that paper with me. So it seems to me that there is traction there that we need to push through and try and get these rights ensconced in trade agreements. It's been very difficult to do, and it's certainly not something that the UK has managed to do in its most recent trade deals with Australia or New Zealand or indeed with India as well. So just looking at the other notes that I've taken here, I think Darius is absolutely right to talk about the Make in India drive that Modi has championed, and seeing India as a manufacturing hub, rivaling that of China. I think they can build that up much more quickly than some of the commentators here were suggesting. I think it is where we should be looking to have our manufacturing. India wants to go way past that, of course, and already has in many respects in terms of tech and IT. But to have India as the sort of powerhouse of manufacturing, global manufacturing that China has now occupied, I think is an achievable goal. And I think it's one that we should be supporting, certainly within the vision for our trade agreements. It's probably running out of my time, so I'll leave it there. But happy to engage in any further discussion with all of the the colleagues on the line.
Barry, thank you very much indeed. With you and Darius, what troopers you are, coming from Gatwick and stepping in at the last minute. And I think we have summed it up, actually. It's a commercial deal. It is not a game changer, but in certain parts of the world, as Darius said, it could be an element of a beacon there. Thank you, Nicolas, Köhler-Suzuki, Anunita, Chandrasekar, Darius, Nasimi, and Barry Gardner for a brilliant debate. My learning curve went way up there. Our next Democracy Forum debate is at 2 p.m. London time on June the 30th, an Asian NATO, pipe dream or future security network? Big question. This was going to be in person at London's National Liberal Club, but due to technical challenges way outside my know-how, we've had to move it back online. But join us wherever you are in the world. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.